welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this particular session, which I'm very excited by because, interestingly, in all of the other conversations so far today, talent, people, the need to select and work with people has come up as one of the key issues. So it's been a common theme. So I think this conversation is coming at the right time of the day to really help those on the webinar to really understand how best they can not only acquire that talent, but also retain them and develop them effectively. So I'm just going to provide a short introduction, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Brian Harney, who's actually going to be our moderator for this particular session. So you're going to hear less from me and more from Brian and the panelists. So this session, Scaling Talent, Acquiring, Developing and Retaining Essential Skills. So it's going to explore the unique talent challenges faced by scale-up companies. We're going to discuss the latest hiring and development trends, how talent needs differ for scale-ups, the evolving role of scale-up leaders, and strategies for building effective teams. So you're going to gain insights from experts on ensuring your company is ready for the next phase of growth. And this isn't just going to look at the practical implications, it's also going to look at policy implications and maybe even some research implications as well as things that we should be studying and exploring. Professor Brian Harney is our moderator for this session. He's a founder and former program director of the award-winning BSc in Digital Business and Innovation at Dublin City University. His research has a focus on strategy and human resource management at the intersection with entrepreneurship, so particularly within a high growth and small, medium-sized firm environment. And he's published widely, recognized across the field, has many best paper awards. I won't read them all out, Brian. Published a range of books, etc., that are go-to resources for those working in the strategic human resource management space. So I'm going to hand over to you, Brian. Welcome you to take the floor and to take the conversation from here.
Great, thank you very much, Simon. And first of all, congrats to you and the full team in terms of this initiative of scaling up and the events you put on for the day. I'm conscious there's a little bit of an echo, so we'll probably try and sort that out, I'd imagine, as we progress. One common theme through all the sessions has been talent, and you identified this already, Simon, but we're biased in the sense that this is going to be the best session because we will speak to talent and the key talent challenges, I suppose, of scaling up. And ultimately, talent is frequently an afterthought rather than a forethought. So it's something that we think of reactively rather than proactively. And what we're very fortunate to have here is a panel that are engaged in some really solid, rigorous, evidence-based research around talent and scaling. So I'm really looking forward to learning a lot. Simon, you've given me the introduction, so I'm not going to say any more about myself. I'll pass over to David first and to introduce himself and the great work that he does.
Great. Give me just a second where my computer decided to switch videos on me. So I'm also excited to have the session on talent. This is something that I keep hearing over and over again as I talk to different leaders of scaling organizations, that the biggest challenge that they have is moving from thinking about capital to thinking about people. At the very startup, we're really focused on getting capital in, and now it's about executing, but you have to execute with people. So I'm a professor of leadership and organizational behavior at ESSEC Business School, which is based in Paris, France. We also have campuses in Singapore and Rabat, Morocco. Before coming to ESSEC 3 years ago, I was a professor of organizational behavior at Georgia Tech, and before that, University of South Carolina. In my previous life to academia, I was a management training consultant working with fast-growing, hyper-growth companies. And so my interest has always been in leader development, how they bring in and develop talent within these fast-growing companies. So I'm excited to talk to you about some research that I've done today, research that I've done in the past, but today to discuss it with you around some in-depth case studies with certain organizations that are scaling and how they're using a talent hotspot strategy, as I like to call it. So that's my introduction. I'll pass it over to Brian, who you would like to go next.
Super. Thank you, David. Look forward to learning more about talent hotspots. Evie Van Lankler, if you don't mind introducing yourself. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Brian. And thank you for inviting me to talk about this, of course, very important topic. I'm Evie, I'm from Ghent University. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at this point. So I finalized my PhD last year, which deals with human resource management in entrepreneurial firms. And with entrepreneurial firms, of course, we talk about startups on the one hand, new ventures, young ventures, but also scale-ups and the scaling process in itself. And I particularly focus on joiners, so startup employees, how they can have impact during new venture development, but also how they can impact the scaling process. You're going to learn much more about the findings of my research, but basically I also looked at the founders, how their roles evolve during the scaling process. So really in a nutshell, I really am passionate about everything that has to do with people and the people challenge in startups and scale-ups. So that's in a nutshell what I'm doing in my research. Thank you.
Super, thanks so much. And fantastic to see such emerging, engaging research in this area. And that includes Sarah Bowen from Galway.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, my name is Sarah. I am from the University of Galway. I am a final year PhD student. We have a centre here, a Centre for Entrepreneurial Growth and Scaling, CEGS, set up by Jonathan Levy and Esther Tipman, who you probably heard great insights from earlier today. I suppose I'm quite close to Evie. I'm interested in those that are managing scaling ventures, and I'm more interested in those that have probably been involved in scaling ventures for twice or three times in their careers. So we saw in Ireland that there was a lot of scaling ventures or indigenous ventures that were taking talent from the multinationals that had scaled successfully out of Ireland, usually into the EU. And we simply just wanted to codify, you know, what had they learned through these experiences and what they were implementing today in indigenous ventures. And I suppose through that we got to see full on, you know, who these people are, a little bit of their history and why they keep joining these ventures. So why are they attracted to these ventures? And ultimately, as Evie said, what impact are they having on the ground? So I'm happy to share my findings and a little bit of that today too.
Super, thank you very much. So the format for this, in terms of people that are listening, is that we're going to do a brief sort of 5-minute pitch, each on our research areas. We'll follow that up with a few questions across sort of common themes, and then we'll invite that, obviously, of course, to Q&A from those that are attending. So because I know least in this area, I'm going to go first and set this broad framing. And then we'll follow with David, then Evie, and then finish with Sarah, because there's a flow there in terms of logic. So let's just bear with me here. So as Simon mentioned, I'm from DCU Business School. We're triple accredited. We're also fortunate to hold a small business charter. So what that essentially means is that we're recognized for our engagement with small firms, scaling firms, and we spend a lot of our time working with local community firms trying to enhance their export intensity. And we're recognized as having some experience in that space. We're also keen on bringing those experiences into the classroom, so that our students are working on live companies, live case studies, and presenting back to owner managers. And that's really my area. My passion is around small firms in particular and scaling. So just to tee this up in terms of where I'm going to talk to is this idea of challenge-based scaling talent. And I suppose the first area that I'll talk to is this idea of an orientation challenge. And this is the idea, I suppose, that the assumption that everyone is on the same page. So this idea of a leadership consensus. And what we do in our education provision is bring top management teams together and ask them hard questions around where they want to go, what type of company they want to be, and see the extent to which they coalesce, or there is a general consensus around some of those things. And what we find is between those firms that can effectively manage growth versus those that struggle a little bit more, part of it comes down to that consensus. Because even in the smallest organization, you might assume that consensus might naturally exist, but some of those conversations have never happened. Equally, this is important for trust and development of relationships. As an owner, manager, or founder transitions to a larger team. And that can invite the importance of things like conflicted collaboration, whereby you're actually welcoming people challenging your ideas or challenging assumptions in, I suppose, a safe environment, or an environment whereby that's encouraged. The other thing about orientation is the idea of strategy conversations and having these conversations embedded in the rhythm of the organization. So, for example, one organization we're looking at, the first strategy workshop they have per year focuses on talent. Pipelines, talent gaps, who's going to replace us as leaders, where's the emerging potential, where's the emerging gaps. So symbolically and also substantively, they're engaging with talent right from the off. And that's just a message then cascading down the organization. Another challenge we can talk to is this idea of relevance. So as we scale, as we go international, how do we understand the markets that we're going to enter? How do we have the right people with the right cultural understanding, global mindset? Something that David, I know, will speak to. So how do we stay relevant as an organization? Equally, as we grow, we layer on processes and systems. And sometimes that can create a disconnect that naturally happened when we were a smaller entity. So understanding end user problems, customer feedback. So coming up with systems that enable us to stay relevant. So I was working with an organization recently, and what they've done is spend dedicated amount of time on what they call exploitation activities versus a dedicated amount of time on exploring the future, ensuring that they're still relevant. So dealing with what we call the relevance challenge. It's not the order I wanted, but the next one then we might call the trade-off challenge. And that's around capabilities for growth. Understanding the critical roles that you will need to fill as the organization grows. So often in organizations, we talk about people, we use names for people. But as we expand, we need to think about the skill sets that are required of a role versus the personality of a function. And that can be a trade-off for organizations. So what to do, but equally what not to do. So we might introduce standardization, but can we retain simplification? We might introduce, segregation between functions, but can we ensure we still are the same community? So balancing some of these trade-offs, understanding the skill sets that we need going forward, and understanding that includes at the top team level. And sometimes organizations need to have what we call honesty attacks, where the leadership realizes they don't necessarily have the skill set to take the organization where they want it to go. So they have to bring complementary skill sets or access expertise that they don't necessarily have on board at the moment. And there's a multitude of ways of which organizations can do that. Finally then is onto the execution idea and how we put these ideas in practice. So how we ensure that we're rewarding people in terms of achievement of purpose, that we're recruiting in terms of values that we have in the organization, and that then is reflected in behaviors. So one thing that will come up in the conversation today is this idea of HR. And, you know, organizations get scared of HR, probably from negative experiences of HR. But if you think of HR not as this some isolated function creating more damage than value, but if you think of HR of the values required of your scaling strategy, behaviors required of your scaling strategy, and how you enable them, reinforce them, nurture them, recognize them, and systematically consider them. And in that case, then, all organizations need to do HR really, really well if they're to manage scaling very, very well. So sorry, that might have been a little bit over. That's the joy of being a moderator, because I wasn't paying attention to the timing. I'll pass over to David, who will be much more succinct and robust in his explanations.
All right, thank you, Brian. I don't know if I can live. Let's see if I can live up to that hope here. So as I mentioned, I work within a SEC business school, so also a triple accredited university, a business school based in France. We're also very global in our reach. Within the DNA of a SEC is an entrepreneurial venture approach to life. SEC Ventures as a incubator for student, master students, and even MBA and executive MBA students. Have spawned off multiple organizations. But one of the key things that was missing in our offer at a SEC is this idea of how do we scale from a talent perspective. And so when I came on board 3 years ago, we looked at how to start this sort of a research teaching, what we call chair, sort of a research center around this. And so one of the first questions we were asking the partner organizations that we're working with and many organizations that we're scaling is what were the challenges, et cetera. And one of the things came as well, as we think about scaling, we want to scale quickly. That's the goal with the best talent. And that's the ideal. We want to bring them on board, bring the best people. And then traditionally, then the next question I was asked, how are you doing this? And really, they were importing from large organizations what could be seen as sort of a magnet strategy, what we call as the attraction, selection, attrition model to talent management. We want to attract the best people, get as many people to apply for our wonderful jobs as possible, select the very best, and keep the ones that really do well, and be able to move off the ones that aren't doing so well and wash, repeat, et cetera. The challenge is that magnet relies on a very strong employer brand that many scale-ups and startups especially do not have. So how do you do this? So in addition to scaling with talent, and you might not have all that talent around you to begin with, maybe in a large city such as Paris, you might have portions of that talent pool. Then you add to the challenge that scalers go through, which is how do we move internationally? And as we were talking to different organizations, we started realizing that they were using naturally, sort of necessity as the mother of innovation, this idea of a hub and spoke approach. That as they found cities and areas of the world that had certain clusters of talent, then they would start hiring those people there. And then now with the social economic changes that we've had, whether it was pandemic cause, which isn't, it was more accelerated by the pandemic, is this idea of working from anywhere, and created this talent hotspots where we have an engineering team over here, we have our operations team over here, we have salespeople in all different types of locations. So creating these hotspots of talent. 3 main organizations that I've done some case studies with, Alkmion and Cypearl, and more from a distance from Zebbia. Different examples, different sizes of scalers. But overall, what we've learned from these in-depth case studies is a couple basic things. Is first and foremost, the table stakes now is you go where the talent is. Don't expect to attract talent to you. The idea is that maybe as you've gotten bigger, as you have that stronger magnet, if you will, you can have people move to you. But more than likely, if you really do want to scale at the exponential growth that you're looking for, then you need to go where the talent is. However, this creates a challenge. All of a sudden now we're 50 employees, 100 employees, 150 employees, whatever month it might be in the year as you grow. But in these lower numbers, and especially if you're at the beginning of your story and your history, what about your culture? You start getting a culture that's very disjointed and fragmented. And so what we saw in the better scalers was this intertwined, what I'm calling cultural acuity strategies, where they build meaningful gathering places. So what does that mean? Well, first and foremost, this idea of building a meaningful gathering place. They may work from home, but there's a place where they can gather when they need to. Zebbia, for example, because of their business model, they are a mainly European based. It's founded in Amsterdam and Netherlands. They're growing globally, is they have customer training sites. So that creates a natural gathering place for the people that are in the area that work for Zebbia to come when they need to have meetings, when need to work on projects together, et cetera. Other companies, and I'm sure we're all familiar, and some of you are probably doing this already, is your meaningful gathering places might be a WeWork site, or it might be a cafe, or heaven forbid, it might be someone's apartment, or you might be renting a spot. But the idea is that you have a gathering place that is meaningful. So what do we mean by meaningful? As you build your culture, you have the same spot. So imagine your favorite pub, your favorite restaurant that you might go to a lot. You might have a stool, a bar stool, or a booth that you always go to as a family or as a couple or as friends. It's something like that. So the WeWork site, you want to gather in the same place. So something as small as this we saw in the better scalers that keeps culture acuity is they sort of gathered to the same meeting room. They made sure that meeting room was available for them to meet in, even though there were many others, because that became a meaningful gathering place for them. The second is, as you have these talent hotspots, it may be very easy to think and be very organized to say, okay, in this area, this is where we get all our great engineers, and over here, this is where we get all our great marketers. And you build the teams functionally. But if you have the talent hotspots by function, what we found in the scalers that weren't doing as well with culture acuity is that they had a very disjointed culture because these subcultures form. So what we found is you may have one hotspot that's really focused on engineering, but don't ignore the talent that you need that might come from operations, marketing, et cetera. They can gather together, and now you have sort of a representative sample at each of these hotspots of your organization. Third is curate cultural acuity with process projects. So let me explain what I mean by that. So as we're constantly bringing in newcomers, as we're scaling, then we constantly need to have better processes. Newcomers are great to get together to say, well, what's the best way to do something, to sort of think through a process. And if you have these hotspots that are multitask, which means they have people from all different functions there, it's a meaningful gathering place. Now they can work on these process projects together. So maybe your engineering and marketing folks and some operation folks that are in Berlin can work on a particular process, where the other folks that are in Paris can work on another process. And now that becomes a way for them to decide how their culture really forms through process and practices. So those are the things that we've been learning so far from this hotspot scaling talent strategy.
Super, David, and plenty we'll loop back on there in a minute. Over to Evie there, please. Cheers.
Yes, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see the presentation? I guess so. So as I mentioned, I am from Ghent University. I'm also a proud citizen of Ghent, and Ghent is quite known for its Hogwarts-like vibes and its beautiful architecture. But some of the things that it's more known for here in Belgium is the fact that it's the technological capital of Flanders. So it houses many scale-ups. It houses 2 of the unicorns, 2 of the 3 unicorns we have in Belgium. But of course, it's very interesting to learn more about this city, how this small city of 270,000 people can actually have so many scaling firms, so much innovation in there. And that is, of course, because we are able to attract so much talent, that we have these great universities, 3 universities on board, all that bring talent to these companies and that help to battle this people challenge that we know is so important in scaling. And that's, of course, the focus of my research. So to give a bit of a context, I worked at a scaling firm for 18 months. So I took on the role of an HR assistant with the idea of, on the one hand, collecting data, but of course also to learn more about the process as a researcher, to be able to talk about this and to write interesting and relevant papers. It's of course highly relevant to actually live the experience. So that's what I've done. Very interesting experience. And this led to a couple of very important insights. So what I did was focus on the founders and the roles they have and how these roles evolve during the scaling process of this AI startup. And a couple of important insights here. The first one is, of course, that the founder role set narrows during the scaling process. So what we typically see is that entrepreneurs, founders have a lot of roles at the beginning of their in the startup phase. So they are CPO, CHRO, office manager, trust person. They have to really attend to a lot of responsibilities. But during the scaling process, we see that these founder roles really become more focused towards strategy. So they have to really become strategy developers, focus on the long-term vision of the organization. I think this also fits in Brian's introduction. So focus on the long-term strategy, on the vision of the company and on this scaling objective. So really make proactive decisions on where to head to, what processes are necessary, but of course also what types of talent are necessary, which jobs are becoming more important, what roles are becoming obsolete. Another important finding is that this process is highly impacted by the joiners, so the startup employees. So it's really a top-down and a bottom-up sort of top-down and bottom-up forces that really impact this process of founder role evolution. So on the one hand, founders can delegate tasks that they feel they shouldn't be doing anymore, or create new roles, new jobs. But on the other hand, we have the employees that really have hands-on experience with the product, with the day-to-day processes. So they can come up with initiatives to spread more excellence, to transform this organization, to make sure that the organization really can comply with the increasing demands linked to scaling, such as the complexer information flows or the higher HR needs. So employees also possess a lot of insights that can really help the organization scale. A third element, or 2 elements, are culture and psychological safety. Those 2 concepts really emerged from our data. So on one hand, culture is of course very important. It guides the employees' actions and behavior so that they know how to behave, what to do, what not to do. But of course, it's also important to manage this culture, like David also mentioned, to avoid the creation of silos, that the sales team has a completely different culture from the engineering team or from the marketing team. Psychological safety was another element that was very important in the context of scaling. You want your employees to take initiative, to come up with new ideas, to generate returns to scale, to become more efficient. They have the knowledge, but they also need to feel an open and safe environment to really take ownership over these ideas. And if something may go wrong, that they are not immediately punished, to say so. So psychological safety was one of the elements that the employees in the scale-up or the scaling firm I worked at highlighted as being very important for them. And a last element is acknowledging the internal labor market. So what we saw was that there was a smaller group of employees, of joiners, that really had a hustle mentality. They went the extra mile. They really took ownership of a lot of processes, and the founders became very reliant on them. At one point, we called them surrogate founders because they took over the role of the founders once they were on leave or at the conference. So they really had the same impact on the organization, or a similar impact as the founders. And what we saw was that they played a particularly important role when it comes to adding layers in the organization. So one of the things that is important in scaling is adding structure, so that the organization decision-making runs fluently. Well, these people, these internal members, are very interesting to look at. So the internal labor market is very interesting to look at in the context of scaling. While we typically see that high growth firms or other organizations will attract external candidates, in scaling, internal candidates can also be very important and interesting, just because of this experience they have with the processes, with identifying economies of scale, or factors that can lead to returns to scale, for example. So in a nutshell, a couple of practical implications that come from our research. Of course, I want to just highlight, if you want to learn more, you can always contact me, because it's too much to list at this moment. So really in a nutshell.
Super, thank you very much, Evie, and I love that concept of surrogate founders. I'm going to borrow that in many ways. I think it's a great concept to think, even just to think of how you delegate and who would be the best surrogate, and how you'd actually manage that, because in essence, you want to act not because you're the owner manager, but nearly in spite of yourself. That's the way you want the firm to sort of run. So the three presentations have focused on challenge, and I know Sarah's work moves to sort of success and continued success, and she's got some really interesting concepts in that respects as well. So I'll pass over directly to Sarah, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that okay? Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thanks.
So I said I'll just share, I suppose, a snapshot of my research. I suppose I get asked a lot about serial scalers and who are they, can they be just anybody that has repetitive scaling experience? But I do think there's a little bit more to that, and I'm sure I'll get asked a little bit about that later. But ultimately what we saw in Ireland, as I stated at the start, was that many multinationals here, their talent had slowly kind of dripped into some Indigenous ventures. And I suppose for Irish ventures to scale, we really need to get off the island. I know Esther spoke about that a little bit earlier. We almost need to kind of scale from inception. So the pace and that kind of wave that comes up against scaling ventures, we need to know quite fast on our teams, how do we manage the scale, and how do we get through that wave successfully and get to the other side, and hopefully also, as an Irish venture, have sustainable competitive advantage. So we may just go through one scaling episode, but the hope is that these ventures will see more scaling episodes again in the future. So I suppose really wanted to codify some of the tacit knowledge of these individuals, and just a little bit about them. So from some pilot interviews I did at the start of my PhD, I realized that serial scalers spoke quite differently. So those that didn't have the most experience or could, I suppose, attain serial scaler status weren't speaking like the serial scalers were. So the serial scalers I speak to today speak a lot about consulting or monitoring, or as Evie said there, taking on a jack of all trades role. So they were really taking over what the CEO was having trouble with, was really finding the bottlenecks to scale. And they were more advising and consulting them on how to cope with this venture moving forward and what the venture would look like in the future. So painting that picture to them about where they were going and how they could ultimately get there. So as I've said, many of them come from FDI and multinational, but I suppose something that was really interesting was over time, from this sample of serial scalers anyways, many are actually failed entrepreneurs. So before their scaling experiences, they may have came out of high school or secondary school here, set up a venture, or tried to set up a venture with some of their college friends, and it failed. And they always kind of had this entrepreneurial intention, but they went on to into a career from their degree, like finance or marketing, and eventually fell into the fascination of the high tech ventures, or these ventures that were entering into Ireland to scale. And some that I've spoken to want to remain in these scaling ventures due to the fact that they're delivering something of high value, that has high returns and is risky. But ultimately they see that the startup stage is over. These ventures should have product market fit, and therefore the risk should be minimized to a degree, which is also quite interesting. In terms of some of the research that we're doing in Galway, we see that ventures are scaling for about 4 years. We know that scaling does not last forever. And from these just under 35 serial scalers, we're starting to see that on average, they're staying in scaling ventures for just over 4 years, which really shows that they stay for the scale and then they can leave quite fast after, which may be quite kind of related to their entrepreneurial interest and intention. And just to share, I suppose, some of the key learnings, I suppose first is this idea that through their experiences, they've developed sets of processes or activities, or I suppose as well, something that they kind of have is a priority list. So when they come in, even before they come into these ventures, they're looking at the culture. And culture really emerged early on, but also as I went through more interviews, culture was always something they went back to time and time again in these conversations. And ultimately that's because when they come in, they feel as though there's this kind of a reboot of culture. It's not a restart, it's not a reset. They're not erasing the culture that's been there to date, but they're more trying to set up what the North Star is and the behaviors and I suppose processes and hiring that will come in that will then reflect what we should do and what we shouldn't do in order to scale. So if you focus on culture first, it's quite foundational. After that, then they're really more monitoring, or I suppose keeping an eye on the cadence and the rhythm of the venture. So if a system is brought in, is it the right time for that system? Do we need a better system now as we grow? And also around, I suppose, KPIs for their own function, and making sure that if they have KPIs for their own function, are they fitting into the overall organizational KPIs and objectives of the founder or the CEO? Another thing then, I suppose we did touch on a little bit today was around this idea that even though discipline is important and standardization is important for scale, serial scalers are interested in an entrepreneurial pursuit that can do more than just scale for today or for tomorrow. They're hoping that they can bring some type of sustainable competitive advantage to the venture, or they're at least setting up a venture to think about how they can innovate or do better. And that there's two sides to that. So in the processes and the way they work, but also in terms of the new innovations or what's going on in the market and how they as a venture are set up to be flexible enough to adapt to that and to seize any opportunity that does arise. And I suppose finally, just going back to that point about the jack of all trades, the serial scalers have developed a toolkit of resources, and they don't really want to rinse and repeat what they have done. In fact, they want to kind of find better ways to do something when they come into that next venture. So they're really leaning into analysing what's going on in this new venture to date and how they can contribute. I suppose we'll speak a little bit more about these implications later, but when looking at experienced individuals like this sample, I suppose the question is, what should you be asking them when you come to hire? And it's really around what can they do versus what they have done. So we tend to focus a lot on what were the prior victories or what were the prior successes of these individuals, but there really needs to be, I suppose, rapport with the CEOs and founders quite early on about what can I do for you and how can I help you, but also are you willing to let me take over a little bit of control or to help you to guide you on that adventure and hopefully scale successfully. And then I suppose that's something to be aware of as well. These serial scalers are looking for the next big venture, the next big company, hopefully an Irish company that they can enter and be part of and go through that experience again. So something to be cognizant of. So that's me, yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful, Sarah. Thank you so much. And flying the flag for Ireland as well, and the fantastic work that we're doing, as well as Belgium and France and Canada, of course, in the context of scaling. But it does highlight indeed the significance of this in terms of policy agenda, which I think is what Simon's talking to with this Scale Up Week. I have a little bit of a deep dive on sort of each of the presentations, if that's okay, and then maybe one or two general questions. And of course, feel free to add some in the chat. David, the concept of talent hotspots and the links to what Sarah said there in terms of the significance of culture. How have you seen companies balance sort of the organic versus the structured dimensions of that, and scaling up that idea, or have you seen that? And another question that sprung to mind is, any examples or your thoughts on sort of how that works in a digital space, or whether it does to the same extent?
So with structure, I think, you know, what's interesting is that from these different case studies, you know, this is sort of a low end size case studies, right? Around 5 companies that I've been looking at pretty deeply doing this. And they've usually reached a particular level of structure already. So they have a sense of how their organization should be now and in the future. Like it's fuzzy. It's more of an impressionistic painting than a Rembrandt, right? It's a Monet, not a Rembrandt. But I think I haven't seen any companies that are doing this that are really still trying to figure out how they should be organized. So there's a basic structure in place. And they have a pretty good sense of what the KPIs are. I mean, they are scaling. So the assumption of scaling is you have good product market fit. You have, whether it's organic growth or inorganic growth coming in. And so therefore now you're scaling. So the challenge becomes, maybe that's what you're getting at with structure, is more around the process. So it's not so much the big boxes that we fill, but how do these boxes play with each other, right? And that's what they are trying to figure out as they grow. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's painful, but all things in scaling are. But what I found as I was hearkening back to, you know, one of those intertwined strategies is that they multitask their talent hotspot. So it's not just bringing engineers for one location and marketers for another, is having that mix. So they're working with each other more organically, and it's easier to work through these sort of painful process structure trade-offs, as you mentioned, trade-offs, right? I think that's where I see a lot of, you know, to peg it to your, and then the second question, I just zoned out on. What was the second question that you're asking me?
So it's just ideas for, I suppose, virtual hotspots, or anything that you've seen in terms of the.
Yeah, I mean, for me, we got so enamored with this idea of place becomes so important that, you know, virtual happens almost in the background more than in the forefront, right? Is that they need a gathering place, and then from that they will work with you